In this video, we will be discussing perfect square numbers and how to simplify the square root of a perfect square number. So before we get to simplifying square roots, let's talk about what a perfect square number is. So the formal definition of a perfect square number is an integer that results from squaring another integer. So there are lots of perfect square numbers, infinitely many, but we are just going to focus on the first 20 perfect square numbers. So let's fill in this table to get the first 20. So 1 squared, or 1 to the second power, is 1. 2 squared is 4. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared is 36. 7 squared is 49. 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is 81, 10 squared is 100. 11 squared is 121, 12 squared is 144, 13 squared is 169, 14 squared is 196, 15 squared is 225, 16 squared is 256, 17 squared is 289, 18 squared is 324, and then 19 squared is 361, and the last one, 20 squared, is 400. So you may be more familiar with the top row, but I also want you to get familiar with the bottom row. So we are going to be referencing these first 20 perfect squares, this table, a lot throughout this unit. So first, let's just practice identifying perfect square numbers. So I have 9 examples. Within these 9 examples, only one of these numbers is a perfect square number. So let's just try to see if we can pick out and circle the perfect square numbers using our table above. So in number 1, the only number here that's a perfect square number is 9, because that's 3 squared. In number 2, the only perfect square number is 16, since that's 4 squared. In number 3, the perfect square number is 36, since that's 6 squared. Number 4, the perfect square number is 121, since that's 11 squared. In number 5, the perfect square number is 4, since that's 2 squared. In number 6, the perfect square number is 196, because that's 14 squared. In number 7, the perfect square number is 324. 324 is 18 squared. In number 8, the perfect square number is 100, since that's 10 squared. And then in number 9, the perfect square number is 361, since that's 19 squared. So a couple things to keep in mind when we're taking the square root of a perfect square number. So the first thing to keep in mind is that you cannot take the square root of a negative number, because squaring a number always results in a positive. So if a question asks you to take the square root of negative 25, this would be no real solution or no real answer, because there's no way for me to take a number and multiply it by itself to get negative 25. So it's just not possible. The second thing you need to keep in mind is that you can, so this one, you can have a negative sign outside of the square root. So you can have a negative sign. So if, for example, you have the negative square root of 25, the square root of 25 would just be 5, and then you would just put that negative sign in front. So that one is possible, but if the negative sign is underneath the square root, then it would be no real solution. Okay, so let's practice some examples on the second page. So we're going to go to the next page and we're going to use our chart to help us. And this is going to make, hopefully, these examples go by pretty quickly. So the square root of 121, that would just equal 11 because we're kind of working backwards. I want to know what times itself equals 121, and it's 11. The square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 81 is 9, but there's a negative sign out front, so make sure you put a negative with that, so negative 9. The square root of 9 is just going to be 3. The square root of 196 is 14, but there's a negative sign out front, so just add a negative in front. The square root of 361 is 19. The square root of negative 49, now the negative sign is underneath the square root, so there's no real solution. So I'm just going to do no solution for that. The square root of 256 is 16. The square root of 225 is 15. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 400 is 20. The square root of 144 is 12. Again, square root of 9, we already saw this one, is 3. The square root of 64 is 8, but don't forget to put a negative sign since there's a negative sign out front. The square root of 169 is 13. The square root of 49 is 7. And then the square root of negative 121, since the negative sign again is underneath the square root, that's a no solution problem. The square root of 1 is just 1. The square root of 289 is 17. The square root of 256 is 16, but don't forget to put that negative sign in front. Okay, now the next examples are a little bit different. So for this example, we're going to take the square root of 25 and we get 5. The square root of 81 is 9. And then it says to add those two answers together. So the final answer for number 30 would just be 14. For 31, since 9 and 16 are underneath the square root, we need to add them together first. So bring down the negative sign, and then 9 plus 16 gives me the square root of 25. The square root of 25 is 5, and then just bring down that negative sign. For number 32, we're going to do them separately since they are separate. So the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. And then when I add those two answers together, I get 7. For 33, they're both underneath the square root, so I need to combine them first. So 36 and 64 add to 100, and then the square root of 100 is 10. For number 34, they're separate, so the square root of 36 is 6, the square root of 64 is 8, and then if I add those two answers together, I get 14 as my final answer. For 35, since they're both underneath the square root, I need to simplify this first. So 64 minus 100 is the square root of negative 36. Since the negative sign is underneath the square root, this would be a no solution problem. Same thing with 36. I need to simplify what's underneath the square root first. So I'm going to do the exponents first. So I get the square root of 169 minus 144, because that's 13 squared and 12 squared. When I subtract these, I get the square root of 25, and then I know that simplifies to just 5. Same thing with 37. I'm going to do 3 squared, which is 9, 4 squared, which is 16, and then add those together. So again, I get the square root of 25, which again is just 5. So this will get easier the more that you practice with the perfect square numbers, but you need to know how to simplify a square root of a perfect square number in order to be able to do what we're going to do for the rest of this unit. So if you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to your teacher.